welcome to the plenary session Fighting for Hope from Paris to 1 point decrease. I'm very happy to meet you here in Liverpool and to discuss the most urgent challenge of our time, the global warming. The need for action is very serious. Arctic ice and glaciers are melting worldwide. Sea levels are rising. Storms, super hurricanes, droughts are becoming more frequent. And we witness a massive coral bleaching. Margaret reported us yesterday, which is just a foretaste of what increasing global temperatures will unleash. If we do not act, we risk the future of our children and of their children. And it's true what former President Obama said. We are the first generation to feel the effect of climate change and the last generation who can do something about it. We have no time to spare. We need drastic changes in the way we live. We need a green conversation, which means a comprehensive social and ecological transformation. And this has to be embedded in a political strategy to enlarge the scope of rights and freedom of citizens. These topics, ecology, social justice, freedom, democracy, they belong together. And protecting the planet is a core green policy issue. We know we have to switch from the fossil to green, to renewable sources. The sun doesn't send us a bill, but coal combustion, that costs us the future. On the way to a fossil-free world, there's hope, but there's also risk. There's hope in the area of global negotiations. The Paris and the New York Agreement about climate goals and sustainable development goals are milestones in the international politics. The impetus has to be sustained and hugely expanded. The risk? Nationalism kills global solutions. Right-wing parties and politicians all over the world, like Donald Trump in the US, Marine Le Pen in France, and other nationalists in Europe and all over the world, they deny complex global problems like global warming and act against international structures and decisions. US President Trump just signed an executive order unwinding Obama climate policies. He made clear that American leadership in the global campaign against climate change would take a back seat to his commitment to energy industry jobs. And even more dramatic, experts warn us Trump has not yet decided whether to formally withdraw from the Paris Agreement. He is an unpredictable risk, but this is not the time for any country to change course on the very real threat of climate change. And therefore, it is very important that other big countries like China, India, Brazil, the European Union, others, Canada, we will continue carrying out the climate change agreements. I read yesterday that China has pledged to stick with its carbon-cutting commitments despite moves by US President Trump. And a coalition of US states, including New York and California, has already vowed to fight Mr. Trump. But still, Trump moves are likely to embolden opponents of climate action around the world. I think Trump is one of the grave diggers of the future. And dear friends from the Green Party of UK, also the constructors of the Brexit are grave diggers of hope, of solidarity, and of our future. How will the EU on the one side and the UK on the other side reduce their carbon emissions? We need action, not a rollback. For us, as Greens, it is absolutely key to keep in mind the interests of European and UK citizens, of human rights, and of carbon reduction during the Brexit process. But it's not easy. It will be very, very difficult to keep this in mind. And I think without this partnership we had in the European Union, it's hard to get these goals. But beside these risks, there is hope as well, especially when we look at the rise of the renewable energies. The renewable energy economy is an economic powerhouse today. In 2015, $286 billion were invested in renewable energies, more than ever before. Renewables can compete with investments in fossil fuels. 47 of the world's poorest countries just committed to generating 100% of their energy from renewable sources as soon as possible. This proves renewable energies are unstoppable, and the huge advantage is very different players act: citizens, communities, cooperatives, farmers. Let me just give an example from Germany. The movers and makers of the German energy transition, we call it Energiewende, which was initiated by a green environmental ministry in the year 2000, have been hundreds newly formed energy cooperatives, tens of thousands of farmers, and hundreds of thousands of individual citizens. 1/3 of the electricity needed is now produced by renewable energies. And more than half of this green electricity is produced by citizens. We call it civic energy, civil energy. It's a huge people's divestment movement. The Energiewende, the energy transition, created almost 350,000 jobs. More than 200 billion euro were invested in renewable energies over a course of 10 years. And in addition, the Energiewende will allow Germany to shut down its last nuclear power plant in 5 years from now. The decisive instrument that created this huge success in one that was later adopted in many other countries, the feed-in tariff, that offers long-term contracts to renewable energy producers and that reduced the costs of solar and wind by 60 to 70%. The risk: there are still powerful multinationals and fossil lobbies against structural change and transformation. They have a huge influence on politics and politicians in Germany and the EU over the world. And therefore, the Green movement has to grow, united behind a climate call to action, collaborating with civil society, working outside and inside parliaments and governments, and we want to be part of the government in Germany again after the election in September. We all have to engage for the future, and there will be lots of opportunities to act for the Green movement. In 2017, there will be the G20 meeting in Hamburg, the COP23 in Bonn, and several national elections in Europe, like in France, in Germany, others. Climate policy is an important measure in the fight against global inequality and poverty. And social justice and democracy are important conditions for a comprehensive climate policy. These issues have to be the most important topics on the G20 agenda. And the 23rd session of the COP will be organized by Fiji and hosted at the UN headquarters in Germany in Bonn. Governments will discuss next steps after the 2015 Paris Agreement. And in 2018, progress on the Paris Agreement will be reviewed, and the IPCC will present a special report on limiting warming to 1 degree. And there will be the European elections in 2019. So there's a lot to do in the next months for the Greens. I think this is a time to act, not to discuss the risk, but to discuss the hopes. There is no planet B, dear friends. With us, the Greens, there is hope, there is power, and there is a passion for the future. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the mentioned issues with 3 wonderful guests today. let's talk together. I'm introduced shortly Carol Dieschburg, Jeb Sanyu, and Papa Meisha Dieng. Carol Dieschburg is the Minister for the Environment, representing the Greens in the government coalition of the state of Luxembourg. My neighbor in the southwest part, but we usually meet on the COPs, not in our area. And Carol represented Luxembourg at the COPs in the past years. She was very present in the COP21 in Paris, and she is one of the constructors of this wonderful Paris Agreement. Welcome, Carol. Jeb Sanyu joined Greenpeace Southeast Asia as Executive Director in January 2016. Jeb leads Greenpeace diverse operations across the Southeast Asia region. He is widely known for his work as Philippines' chief negotiator in the UNFCCC. His impassioned speech in Warsaw in 2013, and I joined this speech, the COP, on the effects of climate change following Typhoon Haiyan touched hearts and minds around the world. Welcome, Jeb Sanyu. Papa Meisha Dieng is the General Secretary of the African Green Federation. He organized the last Global Greens Congress, which took place in Dakar in 2012. And yesterday, we saw some people are here that joined this Green Congress. And he is an expert in international environmental law and teaches at universities in Strasbourg, also in our area, Carol, and in Dakar. A warm welcome to Papa Meisha Dieng. We go on. We have just 10-minute speeches by our guests, one after the other, and when we have a discussion, we are going on with the time, but I'm optimistic that we have time for a nice discussion. And welcome to you all. Welcome, Carol, your next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simone Peter. Good morning, dear friends. It's a pleasure to be with you today and to speak about the chances we will see in fighting climate change and in giving hope to people who expect us as politicians to fight with them climate change. In the 21st century, heroes will be people who will improve life quality, who will fight poverty and introduce more sustainability. These are not my words, these are the words from Bertrand Piccard, the Swiss pioneer, I may say, who made a tour around the world with a solar plane. So he did not use one drop of fuel. In Paris, while negotiating the Paris Agreement, which gives us a framework to fight climate change and to even fight for staying below 1.5 degrees, we made a lot of expectations. We created, as politicians, hope, and we showed that if the whole world would fight, we could get and be united for having a good agreement which will fit the purpose. As a minister in charge at that time of negotiating the EU position, because we had the EU presidency at that time, let me just share some of the ideas I may have for now fighting for the 1.5 to be reality and to get back on the track of ambition, the track we had in the upfront for Paris, because what did we have before Paris? Since September 2014, we had people outside on the street, civil society, backing politicians like the Greens who wanted to have an ambitious Paris outcome. We had science, to be clear, giving us clear wording, which at these times are questioned by world leaders. This should not be the case. And I hope that for the new report, which will come out next year, will be one momentum we should work on and we should catch in order to raise the ambition, in order to get and to stay below the 1.5. That's also the reason why I fight personally, as I did in Marrakesh where we met, for having an indigenous people platform being integrated in the negotiations, because civil society, indigenous people, women need to be empowered and to discuss with us as politicians in order to feel, as politicians, the urgent need of acting, because it's not all real politicians. Not everyone sees, as a politician, the urgency to need and the fight for life that lots of people in the world are having today. So I think it's of utmost importance that we create platforms for civil society, for indigenous people, and that everyone is on board, and also for local authorities, because it will be in the cities, at the level of local authorities, that we will make a difference, and we see it. Lots of Green members are already in local governments, and they take big steps forward because they fight with people. A third thing we had were business actors who told us that it's economically reasonable to fight climate change as fast as possible. And I may say, with the words of Nicholas Stern, why are we waiting? Because we already know that renewables are much cheaper than any other thing we could do, because the sun is shining for everyone and the wind also is blowing. So we have the energy if we use renewables. What was the way to Paris? It were these alliances between people who made politicians move, but it were also the alliances between ambitious governments. So we created, during the first week in Paris, continued in the second week in Paris, an alliance of ambitious, having Tony de Broom, for example, in our alliance, having Canada, having Mexico, having European Union, having lots of people joining us. Every day we got a group of more people working for a good outcome, not only for the 1.5, but working for having 5-year cycles in order to scale up the ambition, working in order to deliver also on finance, because international climate finance is needed, and we need to deliver as industrious countries in order to meet the promises we already made in 2009. So this was the upfront of Paris, having a positive dynamic, creating an emotional will of everyone to take this big step forward was one of the big things we made. That's why we got Paris. So now, in times where we have Trump, in times that climate change is questioned, we have to build on new coalitions. We have to find, as the EU, new partners. So there may be China, there may be Brazil, like Simone already said. But there may also be, and this is of utmost importance, on a local level, people living in the US, in states like California, in cities like San Francisco and New York. Don't forget all those people fighting in a local level and a regional level. So we need to create new alliances with countries, in regional level, in cities, and between the people. And we need to put people in the center and in the heart of our politics, and not big industries. The question for me now, as a European minister, is, will the EU be ready, or will we stuck in internal discussions? My proposal would be, together with Sweden, I know that Isabella was here yesterday to speak about the progress we could make. We thought this February for an emission trading system, for having ambition on it. It were only 4 countries fighting for ambition. And we need also in Europe to make a willing coalition of countries. And that's why I really think that we need more green governments in the future in order to scale up the European ambition, in order to follow our politics. We are discussing energy efficiency politics and renewable politics in the winter package. We are discussing climate politics at the moment, and there is where we would need support and where we will fight as green ministers for have a good outcome in order to deliver, because it is of utmost importance to stay credible, to deliver, that we are able to deliver. Most of you may know Luxembourg as a country and a huge financial center with a big footprint. Yes, you're right. We have a big footprint and we have a financial center. But Greens in a government can make the difference, and I will show you some examples. At the moment, I am having a climate finance task force with my finance minister, and Luxembourg has today 50% of the green bonds in Luxembourg. We have launched a platform for de-risking together with the European Investment Bank, the state giving the guarantee for very innovative projects. And we are working on transparency, especially if it comes to climate finance. So we are making progress using the financial center in order to green it. We are discussing, and we decided as a government, to screen our pension funds and to go on divestment soon. So these are decisions that Greens are pushing in government. Let me tell you about transport. So let me tell you about transport. Transport for us is important since it is 68% of the Luxembourgish emissions. We made, together with a green transport minister, we made a paradigm shift, investing 2/3 of the public money into soft mobility and public transport. This is a paradigm shift we've never seen before, and I think this is shifting the money we need in order to have other societies, other economies. And in economy, we made a plan how to be decarbonized by 2050 and how to be resource efficient. It was not done by government. It was done by our economy minister together with 300 stakeholders discussing about decarbonizing and making a clear roadmap with all the chances we have if we are front runners in Luxembourg on climate change. So this is progress, I may say. And this but you may say, yes, this is not enough. That's why we are building on our civil society. We are building on local authorities. 104 of 105 local authorities joined the government in a voluntary collaboration on climate. We call it Climate Pact. And during the last year, we realized a decoupling from growth, because we had growth by 4%, and we lowered the emissions a lot. So we went from 18 tons per capita to 15.4 tons per capita during 3.5 years. And we are also delivering if it comes to international climate finance, where together with Sweden, Luxembourg has the highest per capita climate finance on top on the ODA, which means that we are having more than 200 euros per capita going to international climate finance, and we're not doing it alone. We're doing it with the NGO sector in Luxembourg. So these are some of the examples I may give you what it means to have Greens in a government and to make a paradigm shift in lots of areas. So we should stay at Green, at our values. We should fight climate change for justice, because climate change will drive injustice if we don't fight it, we don't fight for human rights. So we should fight for human rights. We should empower grassroots women because they are a big part of the solution. We should empower indigenous people, and we should fight for peace, and we should tell it to people that if you fight climate change, you fight for peace, you fight for freedom, because climate change is the biggest threat to humanity. You also fight for democratization of energy, and we have to take the chance to be everyone a prosumer, not only a consumer, but a producer of energy. So we will give, if we go for renewables, we will give back the power to people so that they can trust again in politics, because we don't give the power to big industries. We give it to people in order to make them take the choice what energy they want, in order to make them, again, make the choice what they want to have on their table to eat, for example. So, give back the power to people and tell the good stories. Link the stories, link climate change to air pollution, to health policies. And I was really happy to hear that during the last day, we had the good news that in India, the Supreme Court won against the government for the health of people, because they will prohibit polluting cars. And this is a big one if you have the principle that you put people and health of people in the center of the politics and in the center of decision, and not big industries and economies. So, some last remarks. So there are signs of hope. More than 130 countries ratified Paris Agreement. Now we have to go for ambition in making a good narrative. And I may come back to my initial start to Bertrand Piccard, who went to Luxembourg 3 days ago. He got a whole cinema standing ovation, and he gave us 3 messages. And I may repeat them here in order to make you courage. He said, we must encourage people, and we must encourage politicians to be pioneers, to take the next steps, to switch off their autopilot they are driving in, and to go new ways and create a new world. Because we need it. Because we need it if we want to accelerate transition to a climate resilient and a sustainable world. He said, step out of fossil fuel area will make us free again, and fight for your ideas and be courageous. So fighting for your ideas, making alliances, and taking the opportunities we see in climate change and fighting climate change, this will be a good start for the coming years to discuss. And I hope that those who will run elections will empower and encourage us as Green ministers to do this way together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carol, for your engagement, for your power on the international and national and local level. We need for the engagement for the to work against the climate change and against global warming. Thank you very much. And now I invite Mr. Sanyo for the introduction and then this point of views. Jip.
Thank you very much, Simone. Good morning, everyone. Let me express my heartfelt thanks to all of you, to all the Greens, for this opportunity. It's truly an honor for me to be here. I'm also glad to see that the important themes of climate, democracy, social justice, and globalization are the key conversations that are happening this weekend. I do wish to emphasize that these are closely intertwined issues, and I trust that the synergy around these conversations will happen. The first order of the day, my dear friends, is we must call the climate change challenge as what it really is, a crisis. The climate change challenge is a crisis. In fact, the most serious crisis of our generation, one that we must respond to with utmost urgency, with boldness, but with hope. Just this week, before traveling to Liverpool, I was in my family's hometown of Tacloban City in the Philippines. It would be difficult to remember that in November 8th of 2013, the strongest storm ever to make landfall in the history of humanity hit the Philippines, with my family's hometown as the epicenter, and left a massive trail of devastation and killing thousands of people. Just as the country was reeling from the storm, as Simone mentioned earlier, I was given the difficult duty of addressing the UN Climate Summit in Warsaw in 2013, and I appealed to the whole world to take urgent action. This week, back home in Tacloban, I saw hope. People who feared the ocean after the storm have mustered the courage and have gone back to rowing their boats, surfing on their shores, frolicking on the beach, and they have formed a mass movement clamoring for climate justice. Indeed, the climate crisis is a matter of justice, and this is perhaps my key message for this morning. I borrow the words of Martin Luther King Jr. when he said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." This holds so true on the issue of climate change, which is one of the biggest injustices in history. The story is classic and simple. Those who are least responsible for the problem are the worst affected. The climate crisis is not just some ecological problem. It is a real danger to the realization of basic human rights. The impacts of climate change, as we already increasingly witness on a daily basis, affects the increasingly marginalized, those who are struggling to escape from poverty, and those who have the least capability to defend themselves from the onslaught of this catastrophe. And on top of this, my dear friends, is the injustice that those responsible for this predicament remain powerful, retain control over vast resources, enjoy the disproportionate share of the world's material wealth, and to this day remain remorseless and accountable. How do we then fight this battle? We stand up against every kind of injustice. We must hold to account those responsible, make them stop the damage they willfully cause, and rally the whole world to end the fossil fuel era. Those who have profited the most in causing dangerous climate disruption must be held to account. This is the spirit behind the climate justice and human rights petition that we lodged against the top corporate investor-owned carbon polluters called the carbon majors, which include big companies such as Chevron, ExxonMobil, BP, Royal, Dutch Shell, Total, BHP Billiton, Glencore, ConocoPhillips, among many others. The complaint was filed by communities in the Philippines affected by climate impacts with the Commission on Human Rights. And the Commission has launched the probe looking into whether these companies are violating human rights by significantly contributing to the climate change problem and failing to reduce emissions despite having the capacity to do so and knowingly ignoring the seriousness of climate change. A first of its kind, this landmark petition is moving forward despite opposition from these big companies, from these behemoth companies. The national inquiry public hearings will start a few months from now. This case is just one of many that are starting to grow into this global movement for climate justice and liability. I ask you, dear leaders, to stand in solidarity with these people facing severe climate impacts in the Philippines, the Swiss grandmothers, Pacific Islanders, youth from the United States and Norway, indigenous peoples of Canada, the First Nations, the water protectors standing up against the Dakota Access Pipeline, and many others in their courageous efforts to rise above the challenges of climate inaction and to resist the exploitation. The recent developments that we have seen in the world political stage is showing us just how important it is for us to stand together to make sure that those who hold the most power and resources stop crushing people's basic rights, including the rights to a stable climate and a healthy environment. In the face of adversity, we must remain filled with hope and optimism. If world leaders can muster that political will to address the climate crisis, we know that humanity can find a way. But if world leaders fail to do so, humanity will still find a way, and the people will respond. The good news is that majority of the world's governments, as we have heard today already, are intent on confronting the problem through global cooperation. Today, the Paris Agreement has garnered close to universal support, with at least 190 countries committing to climate action. The Paris Agreement sets forth a very ambitious goal, collective goal to hold Earth's warming well below 2 degrees with efforts to limit warming to below 1.5 degrees. The stabilization of the greenhouse gas concentrations mean countries must put forward greenhouse gas emissions targets that are very ambitious and to do that so progressively. The Paris Agreement adopted a hybrid paradigm with a bottom-up flexibility that is national-driven combined with an international top-down system of rules to promote ambition. But what this essentially means is that the key to solving the climate crisis and meeting the 1.5 degrees goal lies in concrete domestic and grassroots actions and solutions. In order also to ensure that the Paris Agreement delivers on its promises, we do need to ensure accountability and transparency, and that 1 ton of carbon is 1 ton of carbon and no cheating happens. We also need to ensure that climate finance works effectively, especially for adaptation. Right now, out of the $100 billion promised in 2009, and as also reiterated in the Paris Agreement, only $20 billion are intended for adaptation, compared to what the United Nations estimates as needed for climate vulnerable countries by the year 2030, needing at least $140 to $300 billion to cope with the impacts of climate change. We need to provide more finance for adaptation. Another good news is that cities and towns are also making a stand. More than 600 cities, representing close to 500 million people, have committed to the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy. However, there is much more work to be done to fill the gap left by national pledges. Our work with local government units, therefore, is crucial in achieving the 1.5 degrees goal. On the other hand, time is not on our side. 2016 was the hottest year on record. Before that, 2015, and before that, 2014. If the trend continues, we will live through every single year as the warmest year on record. So while the rise in global emissions have started to slow down, it needs to stop rising, and it must drop faster if we want to truly avert this crisis. Paris was an important step. And when I walked for over 1,500 kilometers from Rome to Paris in 2015, we chronicled stories of hope, stories of courage. But it was never the end of the journey. We must forge ahead and prove we are not a species limited to words, but one that takes action. We need to transform all sectors of society to prevent dangerous climate change. We also need to elect leaders who understand this crisis, who will stand up and who are not tarnished by the influence of those who destroy the environment. We are also gathered here today, sadly, at the heels of new measures signed by Mr. Trump to dismantle the climate policies of his predecessor set to combat climate change, which would have put the United States on track to meeting its commitments and also forming part of how it can play an important role in the global context of global cooperation to fight climate change. We are here at the heels of such a vicious attack on global solidarity. We must resist. We must resist these efforts that undermine our solidarity to fight climate change. So no matter what the US government does and what other obstacles that stand in the way, we must forge ahead. It is likewise our stark realization that winning the fight against climate change is something we cannot do without tackling root causes, without confronting the malaise of inequality. Together with the climate crisis, we face this serious crisis of inequality which lies behind all our struggles for a better world. We must fight inequality. In order to stop climate change, we need system change. And if we are truly to win this battle, we must empower women. We must break free from the trap of fossil fuel development and embrace the promise of renewables. But unfortunately, short-sighted mindsets and greedy motives point to Asia, specifically my home region of Southeast Asia, as the fallback for the coal industry. We must work to stop coal investments, which do not make sense at all, except for the short-term profits for those who can't care less about the people and communities impacted by the industry. The answer is shining on us, flowing in our streams, lapping on our shores, and blowing in the wind. We can make this dream happen. The promise of 100% renewable energy is no longer a distant reality. The era of fossil fuels and dangerous climate change will come to an end. As to when, that is in our hands. Ours will be the generation that ends fossil fuels, and we will work hard to do so in a just manner while defending workers' rights. My dear friends, it is truly a great time to be alive. It is a great time to be alive because ours is the generation that will find the courage and the political will to turn things around. The choices are laid down before us. We can choose a path of misery, with the climate crisis going beyond the point of no return, or we can choose a path of hope, which means embracing the most massive social and economic transformation where people care and greed does not govern the world. And what we do witness right now is not just a moment in history, it is now a movement. People are standing up against greed, against arrogance, against apathy. To those who stand up and link arms for what is right, we must stand with them. To those who walk towards the new dawn of hope, we must walk with them. This is a battle we cannot afford to lose, and therefore our only option is to march on. Yes, my dear friends, we do have a problem in the atmosphere. I think we all know that. But the bigger problem lies in our hearts. Ultimately, this crisis is about our ability to care. If we go beyond the point of no return and we stop caring for each other, for our future, for our common home, that is the most dangerous tipping point we must avoid. But we can fix this. But we can fix this and we can stop this madness. I am truly honored to be walking with all of you on this most important journey towards a new dawn. Finally, to reinterpret the words of the Philippines' national hero, Jose Rizal, may I say, I will die without seeing the dawn brighten over our earth, but we have planted the seeds of change for those who will eventually live to see the sunrise. Stand proud, embrace and be bathed by the light, but forget not those who have fallen during the night. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeb Sanyu, for the clear and strong words for more climate justice and for the solidarity we have to give those countries who still already suffer from our acts in the industrial countries. And now I have the pleasure that Papa Meisha Jing, sorry about this, will introduce his points of view. You have the floor. You're welcome.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Bonjour.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. We've just heard two statements which tell us that time is not on our side. It's not on our side, and we therefore need to have a system change. Now, a system change, for us, this would mean asking whether democracy, the way we understand it today, whether this democracy is compatible with the climate. Is it climate compatible? My comments today stem from a meeting that we had in Marrakesh. This was in the run-up to COP22. We were invited by the Academy of the Kingdom, and we were asked to give some thought to the following topic: climate change. What challenges for politics? Our democracy, as we have already noted, doesn't seem to be up to the standard required for this ecological challenge. And therefore, the statement that I would like to make is a statement that regards prospective opportunities. We've heard about biocapacity just now. And in the light of that, I think we are called upon to ask ourselves the following question: how can we bring to convergence the logic of climate change, the institutions, the public policies that we have, participation, and at what level of consistency are we able to do that? What coherence? The climate as a challenge no longer means that we really need to understand it in order to defend ourselves. We've just heard that. I think that defending ourselves is something that we have indeed understood. But we also need to restrain ourselves, understand that there needs to be restraint. And that, in a way, shows that the current model is in crisis. Human life, as we all know, has become a biological activity which is changing the world. Anthropologists would call this the Anthropocene era. The Anthropocene era, as I'm sure you're aware, dear friends, it has been defined by an eminent professor of Aix-Marseille University, Baptiste Morisot. So, the Anthropocene era is, if you like, a fiction of the new geological era. Human beings are at the core of these relations with the living and with nature, with the environment. This relationship means that the human being emerges as a geological powerhouse, if you like. So if we are to face up to this crisis and also to the bill that is inflicted upon us because of climate change, what are the responsibilities that we need to shoulder? Is it the principle of common responsibility but varied responsibility depending on circumstances? Does it mean that we have new responsibilities to shoulder based on values? Or are we talking about two types of responsibilities, Paul Ricker's responsibilities, by which I mean responsibility regarding the past and responsibility also looking towards the future? Dear friends, I would say that this is the challenge that our democratic institutions have to face, and they are absolutely duty-bound to face this responsibility, to implement the identified climate policies that we require. And on that note, once we have identified the climate policies that we need, and I know that various conferences have addressed these different policies, once that is done, we also need to ask ourselves another question. Our democratic representative political model, is it up to it? Is it able to implement, to roll out these policies that we have identified? That's the first thing we need to ask. And then earlier on we spoke about the First Nations, about the involvement of indigenous peoples. Does our model allow for people on the periphery to participate in this exercise? That's another question. So what is the model of representative political democracy that we require in order to roll out the climate policies and environmental policies that we need? In terms of institutions, I would say that we have a triptych when it comes to the changes that we're currently witnessing. Territorial policies, science, and also technical aspects. Now, in terms of territory, on that point, we could ask ourselves, does the law actually allow us to cover the entire legal reality as it stands when it comes to environmental problems? As we all know, environmental problems are not contained by frontiers, by boundaries. They're not contained by territory. Ecological territories are not the same as other territories. There's also the issue of trust and confidence, which lies with the state. The state, I think, is a sine qua non in this equation. We cannot circumvent the state. But I do, nevertheless, ask you, I mean, the state is based on a contract initially. Is that state, the contract-based state, able to strike the new balance that we now require in this era? That is a question I would ask you. And how can we go about building or establishing a new legal framework? Could we talk about eco-territories, I wonder? And then there's the time factor, the time challenge. I think it raises a number of legitimacy issues. We are looking both towards the past and towards the future. This issue of legitimacy is raised by Benjamin Constant, who makes a distinction between two different fields that we have at the moment. On the one hand, for instance, we have the upper chamber and then the lower chamber. By the higher chamber, I think he means the assembly of elected politicians, the elected representatives. And the other, if you like, represents continuity, long-term continuity. And by that he's referring to the Senate and to the legacy of that Senate. Now, when you're dealing with a problem like climate change, we know that this problem will actually become more and more apparent over the long term. Many of the harmful effects will be felt in the long term. So what kind of representation can we organize for that? And then I come to techno-science, the techno-scientific government, the last element of this triptych. Here we're talking about an operational mode of functioning, if you look at it from the traditional perspective. In fact, you can see this if you compare, on the one hand, the Montreal Protocol and, on the other hand, the Paris Convention. The The Montreal Protocol is derived from human intelligence. It has, for instance, found solutions to the greenhouse gas effect. The Paris Convention moves us from the scientific field and the technical field to the political field, the political stage. And what about citizens in all of this? Where do they find themselves? We have experts, we have councils, we have meetings. The citizens, when faced with all of this, might get the impression that we have an institutional crisis on our hands. So, for citizens, what kind of participation can we actually organize? What kind of form would this civic participation take? Victor Hugo talked about progress. He said that it is basically revolution on an amicable basis. What does that mean in terms of our debate? Our debate is about the narrative of ecology. How do we construct that narrative? How do we place the human being in its environment, the ecosystem? How do we integrate everything that can actually help us improve our knowledge about ecosystems? And the debate is also about transformation of economic means and methods of production, consumption, and the drafting of policies. These are the challenges that await us, dear friends. And at that level, I would say that possibilities for international institutional deliberation have emerged. We have such fora. We have, for instance, the Secretariat of the Paris Convention in Bonn. We have the Sustainable Development Goals, which are managed in New York. We have the Human Rights Council, which is situated in Geneva. Now, in actual fact, this model of supranational representation, in a way, is symptomatic of the problems that we have in terms of shaping representation for this positive perspective. We have the example of Europe. Europe, I think, is a special case. But this system, this possibility of universal deliberation, it does not necessarily rely upon the creation of a transnational consciousness, and therefore it is up to citizens to think of alternatives, to launch alternatives, to do this according to the citizens' choices and not necessarily technocratic choices. These alternatives, ladies and gentlemen, of course have to be inspired by knowledge, by data. We need to work towards the greater good. We need to also produce something that is collective and intellectual, not Gramsci's intellectualism, but our intellectualism, his being the organic one. And in that context, I would argue that there are two paths open to us. On the one hand, we could carry on with the form of modern representation that we have, although it has, to be honest, started to change. There's been a metamorphosis. Rosan Vallon has pointed this out. Or alternatively, we have the ecological model of democracy, and I personally would opt for the second path, the ecological one. The path of ecological democracy is one that introduces representation, where we choose to represent ourselves. It also introduces legitimacy, proximity, closeness, and this can emerge, wherever we have deliberative institutions. It is therefore for us to reinvent a new mode of democracy. It is in our hands. I would call it sociocracy, if I may. This would be based on our territories, on our lands. We would give more powers to local authorities. We would include citizens in the decision-making process. How do we go about doing this? Well, we will have to set standards. How do we set standards? How do we set standards for ecological responsibility, you might ask? Ecological democracy, if we are to go down that path, will raise new challenges. For instance, what about future generations? How are they to be represented? How can future generations be represented in our institutions, which are, of course, defined in terms of time? I may refer you to Karl Marx. Karl Marx asked, why should I commit myself to future generations who have done nothing for me? I think the issue here is not to fall into the traps of procedural democracy, where participation only has to do with the technicity of the instrument, the technicity of the language. Let us not fall into that trap. Several instruments have been developed. I'm thinking here of Porto Alegre, which became, if you like, the founding myth of the participatory ideology. And we have a lot of experience derived from that. Participatory democracy is something that has, emerged in many different ways. Citizens' assemblies, participatory budgets, referenda, popular initiatives, citizens' initiatives, and so on and so forth. So these are different instruments. They will, of course, vary depending on local circumstances, national circumstances, the kind of debate we're having, whether they're scientific, technical, or other. Now, what regrets might we have? Well, we have, on the one hand, the laws, we have the rights that we have, but over and beyond that, where do human beings meet? Where do they come together? What about the human rights of the citizen himself? René Cassin has said some interesting things about that. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we have a moral scruple before us. What is this moral scruple? Well, it is basically saying, at what point do we take cognizance of the other as someone different to us, but also part of us? And it seems to me that only solidarity can help us out in this regard. Human beings have to be there as the guarantor. Human beings have to be there to provide the answers to the questions we are asking ourselves. By way of a conclusion, I would then say, unlike modern representation, ecological democracy is a form of good governance. It can be put to the test not so much in terms of its ability to satisfy immediate references coming from the people, but rather it can be tested in the extent to which it does not sacrifice the climate, the extent to which it does not oppose climate and development. The two should not be in opposition. Climate conditionality, and some might call this a sort of double penalty, should not be something that we impose on our African countries, African nations. First of all, African nations are the poorest in the world. That is one reason. But also, if we are to lift them out of poverty, we're asking these nations to take certain measures, and yet the people asking them to take these measures are not making the same effort themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
You come back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Papa Messias Jeng. I'm very happy about your speech, because it's a good introduce how we can have more democracy in the institutions, and the combination of democracy and solidarity. It's no opposition. It's a common thing, and we have to care about our democracy process, and about the institutional common development of policies. Thank you very much. We have now a little bit time to talk. I don't know, there should be some questions from Facebook. I don't know if they come in. Otherwise, I have a question, because we are close to some very important meetings, the G20 and the COP 23. We all talked about the problem that some countries, some leaders will not join the common sense of the COP21. So my question is, what are the ideas, what are the strategies just for those important meetings in summer and in autumn, to find a common way to find this solidarity and the international strategies we all need to fight against global warming and the climate change? Do you have an idea for a short-term process, also including a long-term idea? Carol, I would like to start with you.
Yes, of course. So it's a bit like I explained. So we will need to create new alliances of ambitious people and to create a momentum. For the momentum, We need all actors. So we need the NGOs, the citizens, so we need to speak about democracies. But for the alliances, we need to have like China, who is making big progress. So we need some of the big ones in order to raise the ambition before the next steps. We need the coalition we had as Europeans, not only between Europeans, but also we had a coalition with the ACP, with the least developed, who are mostly touched by climate change. So we need to have every player on board who is willing to take the next steps. And for this, for example, Europeans need not only to deliver at home and show the right signal that we will stay leaders in implementing and showing that we can decouple, but we need to deliver on finance, as it was said rightly. So it has to be capacity building. We need to work on implementing the Paris Agreement as a strategic, making plans together with the France, be it in Africa, be it in small islands, in order to raise the ambition also on financing adaptation. So for instance, in Luxembourg, we decided, because we know that the need for adaptation money is very, very high, so build up resilience will be important. So we decided to have 40% adaptation, 40% mitigation, and 20% in forests, which is for both. So they divided half-half. So we need to deliver and create a good momentum and make the alliances. So we are working with China at the moment, but we are also working on different levels. Because if we don't have the local level, because 75% of the people will live in cities, I suppose, in the future. So cities, in investing in resilience, will be key actors. And we have to work a lot on a local level, also with the US cities, in order to stay on the ambitious side, in order to put pressure and put politicians at a very, very high level to take the next steps. So I make a call upon all here to take the responsibility to work wherever you are in order to fight for ambition. So this would be the next steps to take.
Jeb, what is your call to the people? I mean, we focus on the best solidarity and the best structure for international progress. That would be the United Nations. The G20 is just a small but very powerful meeting. And what is your hope, your scare about this meeting? Or how do you see the next steps, also including the COP23 from your point of view? You focus on finance, but there are other things, political things, that must now go on the floor and have been discussed.
Yes, absolutely. We're dealing with a lot of elephants in the room right now, and well, the United States as a party to the climate convention had always been an elephant in the room, whether it was the Kyoto Protocol or even now with the Paris Agreement. I think we need to dig deep into our hearts, how we talk to those who feel they have been left behind. It saddens me to think that one person can be so powerful and change the course of history in a bad way. So the task before us as progressives, as people who care about the environment, as people who care about the promise of the Paris Agreement, and whether it's the G20, which is a diverse group of leaders, we need to learn how to communicate with people who elect this kind of people. And I think that's a very difficult task. And if we're talking about the short term, I think that is a mandate for all of us. That is not an option. We need to learn how to do that. On COP23, it's a very important meeting because it's going to be the start of negotiations for the rules of the Paris Agreement. How, for example, measurement, reporting and verification rules are going to be shaped. That has to be very clear, and it's also going to provide the platform how countries are going to negotiate on the guidance for the global stocktake that will happen in 2018 and every 5 years thereafter. So if we screw up the guidance for this global stocktake, how we will assess the adequacy of commitments, especially as far as mitigation finance is concerned and the resources for adaptation is concerned, then we will find it very difficult down the road. So COP23 is very crucial, so that all of these considerations must be on the table. Again, going back to the elephant in the room, I'm very conflicted whether we want the U.S. being there and not really there. So that's something that we need to reflect on.
Yeah, thank you very much. The elephant in the room is the opposite of the participation process, because it's going back to national decisions, to almost autocratic thinking, and a rollback on the whole international cooperation process. So what do you think, Papa Messias Jeng, about the next steps? You focused on the ecological participation, on the democracy process. These are long-term processes, and we need it. What do you think are the next steps for the next months?
Thank you very much.
Well, personally, I'm not a climate skeptic. I wouldn't say that. But I wouldn't necessarily think that negotiations as such, negotiations based on the funding of the fight against climate change, are going to resolve the problem, I'm afraid. $100 million for adaptation and mitigation. I actually think, and I would again come back to François Morizet, who might not be an ecologist as such, but for us as African countries, she came up with some interesting proposals. The problem is the system, the systemic problem, the model of development which lies at the very heart of the ecological or environmental dysfunctioning we have. The ecosystems or the climate consequences are derived from that. Now, we're told, as poor countries, people come along and say to us and make financial promises. For instance, the very term adaptation. Adaptation is not a change. You just tweak what you have, basically. It's a way of accepting what you have. You just tweak it slightly. You modify it slightly. I don't think that's good enough. I think we need to think deeper than that. We need to think of real alternatives. I'm actually very pleased to have heard what we were told yesterday, what's happening in the Nordic countries, the clean technology revolution, for instance. I was very inspired by that. We know that multinationals and the powerful people who are the owners of polluting technologies don't necessarily want to get rid of these technologies. It's very selfish. It's a selfish way of proceeding if you don't actually step up to the plate and transfer clean technologies to the poorer countries. I mean, we could actually fight climate change better if we had clean technologies, but clean technologies cost a lot of money, and the traditional industries refuse to do it. So what are they doing? They're going to be redeploying, or if you like, relocating pollution to poorer countries. That's their intention. And that means that the cycle will just go on and on. The cycle will not be interrupted. Polluting industries, if they just move from the north to the south, that is not going to change the problem. And therefore, I think we need to be really committed and really rigorous in the proposals that we have to make, particularly on clean technologies, because I think that in the medium term and in the long term, it is clean technologies that will allow us to break this vicious cycle of climate change and the warming of the planet. We need to act against this egotism, because this egotism means that industries will not share the technology they have. And financial instruments per se will not resolve anything. 100 million, 500 million for climate, it's nothing really. It's a drop in the ocean.
Vous avez tout à fait raison. So what we promised is only a drop in the ocean. As industrialized countries, and what I mentioned, what we do on climate finance is only one drop. The systematic change of an economic and societal model is needed. But this is also included in the Paris Agreement. So we have not only the objective of staying below 1.5 degrees, we have to make long-term strategic approach, which is the second objective, to make plannings together. And I think one way to do this is what we do on, if you look at the planning side of it, the capacity building, and thus working as partners is one of the important, and capacity building in all the countries is one of the ways we do all together, because we are all, if you look at climate change and sustainable development agenda we adopted in 2020, we are all developing. So we need to consume less and develop down our emissions, and you need to develop, for example, economical welfare and societal welfare, and we need to make capacity building. So I always talk about shifting the trillions, but at all levels and in all countries, in investing in a resilient world, and thus making mitigation promises also coming true. So I think it's really the third objective, making finance flow consistent with decarbonized development, which is one of the utmost important things to do together, which is also included in the Paris Agreement. And then my last point would say, one really important thing you said is that we need to work for monitoring, verification, and really taking the steps together to see if we make progress and to make the 5-year cycles. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to get to 1.5. So we need to stick on the ambition we had in Paris and before Paris.
Oui, mais vous me permettez, rapidement.
May I respond to that quickly? Madam, when the big powers, the powers that be, need to intervene in Iraq and Libya and elsewhere, apparently they don't need all this time. It doesn't take that much time for them to intervene on those occasions. The world has so much economic power. Therefore, if there were a political will behind it, we wouldn't have had to wait so long.
Thank you very much. I'm very sorry that we cannot allow the questions from the floor, because we are very close. There are some... I'm sorry if we just had this time, 20 minutes. Sorry, the time is over, and we have a wonderful video still waiting about divestment, and so the time is over. We need some time for the break, and then the following sessions are coming. So perhaps it.
You should look at the crowd once in a while. You always look on the other side. It is not direct.
That's right, but I think we have the possibility to discuss during the break. Okay, we decided one question, and you have the floor. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I think the biggest polluter historically and even today are the OECD countries. It's not what you do in the developing countries that's going to make a difference on 1.5 or not. The OECD countries have to cut down on their carbon emissions very fast. They are not acting at home. They are bribing the South with money rather than acting at home and cutting their carbon footprint. Start at home in OECD countries and cut your carbon footprint, then we will reach 1.5, not by doling money to the South in doing new technology or this or that. They've got enough solar out there in tropics to manage themselves. But you are addicted to carbon and uranium, and it has brought our planet to the edge of survival that you have. So OECD countries should be our first focus.
Thank you very much. It was more a statement than a question, but it was a good statement, and we have to go on with the discussion.
Footprint in OECD countries, yes, I asked it.
Yes, Carol,
Yes,
please.
I may answer you. You're completely right.
Right.
Europe is reducing its emission by 40% to 2030. So we are reducing, and Luxembourg, my country, accepted also the highest, together with Sweden, the highest reduction ambition target. So we want to reduce our target, which is quite clear, and you're completely right. We have to work at home and to deliver. So this is, you're right, and we have to start in our own countries. That's what we try to do, and that was my call, to empower the green parties who are really fighting for climate change.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much listening to the discussion. I'm sure that we will continue some aspects in other sessions. I think it is clear that it's a need to action, to invest in renewables, to think together the climate crisis, the democracy, the participation in social justice, the human rights and women rights. We need to form coalitions. We need the alliances, states like China, EU, developing countries that work together with grassroots organizations, Greens in all the countries on the local levels, and we need more than to transfer money from north to south. We need technologies, but we also need the democracy process. We need institutions that work, and we need the international process, the solidarity to go on. And I'm very glad that we have now a video about divestment, because we have to divest on all levels, from the fossil to the renewable energies, and then a small introduction about a brochure the EU conceived. We have some words of Jakob Ache after this video, but now let's start the video, and thank you very much, your wonderful speakers here on the floor. Thank you very much, the auditorium.
Hello, friends. This is Bill McKibben from the States. How I wish I was there with you in person. But as you may have noticed, we have a little bit of work to do over here in the United States. Not an amazingly great moment for the world right now, it must be said, between Mr. Trump and some of the political currents in the rest of the world, and probably most powerfully, the ongoing march of climate change. This is a difficult stretch that human beings have entered into. The news from the Arctic and the Antarctic is dismal, and the news from pretty much everywhere else in the physical world is a constant reminder of how quickly we need to get to work, which is why, man, oh man, am I glad for your guys' existence, leadership, and fire in the belly, and willingness to go to work. You know, we've all gotten to work together a lot on things like the divestment movement, which is one of the bright signs in the world right now. Endowment portfolios worth more than $5 trillion now, divested in or in part from fossil fuel. $5 trillion strikes me as a largish sum, though it would be better were it more. And so we will keep working. It is a perfect way to put pressure on institutions, on governments, on iconic cultural players like museums. We need this happening all over the world. And it is beginning to happen all over the world. And of course, the Greens are a reason that it is all over the world. I've had the pleasure in the last year of being down in Tasmania, working with Bob Brown and the Greens down there, and, you know, up above the Arctic Circle, working hard with Greens and others on the work they're doing in countries like Norway. That movement is real. Our movement is big and broad and growing. I don't know if it's growing fast enough to catch up with physics. None of us can know. All we can know is that we have to try as hard as we can And what you should know is that in these difficult times, the existence of y'all is a great encouragement and bolster to all of us back here. We will do all we can to fight pipelines and coal mines and fight the financing for, and not just fight, to help build the framework for the spread of democratic, locally controlled energy all across the world, because miracles are possible. The price of a solar panel has fallen 80% in the last decade, which is a kind of small miracle in itself. And it means that the table's set for the change that we need if we can break the power of the fossil fuel industry, if we can just get the world pushing hard in the right direction. Nobody pushes harder than you guys. Thank you for it. And I look forward to standing shoulder to shoulder with you all on many occasions coming up.
One minute, not more, then you can have your well-deserved coffee. I wanted to make you aware of a new brochure that we just published because it's about the topic that we just talked about. So if you're very motivated after all these speeches now to get active and to do something, just grab a brochure out there at the entrances. There are people distributing them. It should be up here, the title. Can you maybe put the slide on? There it is. The brochure is called The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, Europe's Big Polluters and How to Divest from Them. It's the biggest European fossil fuel industry companies. We have some information about them and some information what you can do against them. So as we heard, these are the main targets that we have to tackle because they are the main drivers of climate change. So we explain a little bit what to do there. And then also another information from May 5 to May 13. There's the global divestment mobilization, as you may have heard. So in many parts of the world, there will be actions on divestment, and you can be part of it. So, and if you want to discuss a little bit more, we have another session on divestment this afternoon and another session on COP23 tomorrow morning, so you're all welcome to be there. Thank you.
Today, down by the beach, and it's where I long to be.